He mocked her for marrying a poor mechanic. That's the phrase people in Cedar Hollow use for years, usually behind cupped hands at church potlucks or over fences while trimming hedges. Junette Marsh could have married better, they said. She'd had options. Instead, she chose a man with grease under his fingernails and a garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. What none of them knew, what not even Junette fully understood for 26 years, was that the same toolbox her husband carried to work every single day held something that would turn every one of those whispers into an apology. By the time the truth came out, the people who laughed the loudest would be the ones standing outside his garage asking to shake his hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a wedding nobody in town thought should happen, and a toolbox that sat quietly in the corner of a garage for over 2 decades waiting. Junette Halloway was 23 when she met Corwin Marsh. She worked the counter at Dell's Hardware on Route 9, the kind of job that paid just enough to cover rent on a studio apartment above the laundromat. Corwin came in most Thursdays for parts, usually a belt or a gasket for whatever engine he was fighting with that week. He didn't say much at first. He'd set his items on the counter, count exact change out of a coffee can he kept in his truck, and thank her by name even though she never remembered telling him what it was. It took him 4 months to ask her to dinner. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Her mother wasn't as quick to approve. Deborah Halloway had raised Junette on stories about the life she deserved, the kind with a wraparound porch and a husband in a suit. When Junette brought Corwin home for the first time, Deborah shook his hand, looked at the calluses on his palm, and later told Junette in the kitchen that a mechanic's wife spends her whole life waiting for a phone call that says her husband got hurt on the job and there's no insurance to cover it. Junette married him anyway, in the spring of 1998, in a small ceremony behind the Methodist church with folding chairs borrowed from the fire hall. Corwin wore his one good suit, his toolbox, an old steel craftsman chest that had belonged to his father, sat in the bed of his truck during the reception because he refused to leave it unattended, even for his own wedding. The years that followed were not easy, but they were theirs. Corwin opened his own shop, Marsh Auto Repair, on the edge of town, a single bay with a hand-painted sign and a bell on the door that never quite rang right. Junette kept the books, answered the phone, and learned to stretch a grocery budget further than most people thought possible. They had 2 children, a boy named Dale and a girl named Willa, and a modest house on Fenwick Street that Corwin fixed up himself, 1 room at a time, whenever there was money left over. Money left over was rare. The shop brought in enough to get by, not enough to get ahead. There were years when the furnace broke in January and they wore coats inside the house rather than call a repairman they couldn't pay. There was a stretch in 2009, after the recession hit and half the town stopped fixing cars they couldn't afford to fix, when Corwin took on odd jobs mowing lawns just to keep the lights on at the shop. Through all of it, the toolbox stayed with him. It went to work every morning in the bed of his truck and came home every evening, sitting by the back door like a third member of the household. Junette used to tease him about it. She'd ask why he treated a beat-up steel chest like it was made of gold, and he'd just shrug and say his father had given it to him. And some things you don't question, you just keep. What Corwin never told her, because he genuinely didn't know it himself, was that his father had said something strange the day he handed it over. Corwin had been 19, home from a semester of trade school, and his father was already sick by then, the kind of sick that doesn't get better. He'd put his hand on the lid of the box and told Corwin that everything a man needs is already inside. He just has to be patient enough to find it. Corwin had assumed his father meant the wrenches. He'd never had reason to think otherwise. For 26 years, that toolbox sat through oil changes and brake jobs and the slow, grinding effort of building a life from almost nothing. Nobody in Cedar Hollow paid it any attention. Why would they? To everyone who saw it, it was just a battered steel chest that belonged to the poor mechanic married to a woman who could have done so much better for herself. They had no idea what was welded into the bottom panel, sealed there decades before Corwin was even born. The present caught up to Corwin and Junette Marsh in March of 2024, 26 years into their marriage, in a way neither of them saw coming. Dale was 24 by then and living 2 states away, working construction. Willa was 21, finishing her degree at a community college on loans neither of her parents could help pay down. The house on Fenwick Street had a new roof, mostly paid off, and Marsh Auto Repair had survived long enough to become a fixture, the kind of place people trusted with their cars even if they never said much about the man who ran it. Then the landlord who owned the strip of buildings along Route 9 sold the property to a developer out of Pittsburgh. The new owner raised the rent on Corwin's Bay by 60%, effective in 90 days. Corwin tried to negotiate. He offered to sign a longer lease at a smaller increase. He offered to pay quarterly instead of monthly. The property management company, a firm with a name that sounded more like a law office than anything connected to cars, sent back a form letter that thanked him for his interest and restated the number. 60% was not a number Marsh Auto Repair could absorb. Corwin ran the math 4 different ways at the kitchen table with Junette, and every version ended the same place. Either they raised prices high enough to lose half their customers to the chain shop near the highway, or they closed. Junette watched her husband age 5 years in the space of that spring. He stopped sleeping past 5 in the morning, not because he wanted to get an early start, but because his mind wouldn't let him rest. He started skipping lunch, not to save money exactly, more because eating felt like one more thing he didn't have room for. 26 years of building something from a single bay and a hand-painted sign, and it was going to come apart because a man in Pittsburgh wanted a better return on a building he'd never once set foot inside. It was around this time that Delphine Ashworth re-entered their lives in a more pointed way than usual. Delphine had grown up 2 grades behind Junette in school, and their paths had crossed at every reunion, every fundraiser, every occasion where Cedar Hollow's more comfortable residents gathered to remind each other how comfortable they were. Delphine had married Reginald Ashworth, who owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties, and the 2 of them lived in a house on Aspen Ridge with a circular driveway and a fountain that ran even in winter. Delphine had never liked Junette much, not because of anything Junette had done, but because Junette had, in Delphine's eyes, settled. Settling was the one thing Delphine could not forgive in another woman. Delphine found out about the rent increased the way she found out about most things in Cedar Hollow, through the hairdresser, who had heard it from a cousin who worked at the property management company. By the following Tuesday, half the women at the Cedar Hollow Garden Club luncheon knew that Marsh Auto Repair might be closing. Junette wasn't at that luncheon. She heard about what was said there secondhand, from a neighbor who felt she deserved to know, though the neighbor delivered it with the particular gentleness people use when they're about to hurt you on purpose. Delphine had apparently held court for a good 10 minutes on the subject. She'd said, more or less, that some people spend their whole lives proving their mother's right. She'd said it was a shame, watching a woman like Junette, who could have had any life she wanted, end up scraping by with a husband who couldn't even keep his own garage open. She'd said the word poor with a particular emphasis, the way people do when they want a word to land somewhere specific. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Junette didn't cry when she heard about it. She'd stopped crying over Delphine Ashworth a long time ago. What she did instead was go out to the garage that evening, sit down on the old stool by Corwin's workbench, and watch her husband work on a neighbor's transmission in the fading light. His shoulders bend in that particular way exhaustion bends a person. And think about how strange it was that a woman with a fountain running in her own front yard in January could still find it in herself to feel superior to a man who fixed things for a living. She didn't tell Corwin what Delphine had said. Not that night. He had enough weighing on him already, and Junette had learned over 26 years which burdens were hers to carry quietly. She went to bed early, lay awake longer than she wanted to, and told herself that this too would pass, the way the furnace breaking had passed, the way the recession had passed, the way every hard season before it had eventually, somehow, passed. She had no way of knowing that the toolbox sitting by the back door held the answer to all of it, or that the humiliation waiting for her at the town's spring fundraiser 3 weeks later would be the very thing that finally forced it open. The Cedar Hollow Spring Fundraiser happened every April at the community center on Birch Street, a benefit for the volunteer fire department that had somehow, over the years, turned into the unofficial social event of the season. Tickets were $40 a plate, which was steep for Cedar Hollow, and the money went to new equipment and training, causes nobody could argue with. Junette and Corwin went most years, not because they enjoyed the crowd particularly, but because the fire department had once pulled a neighbor's cat out of a burning shed, and Corwin believed in paying debts, even ones that weren't strictly his to pay. That year, Junette almost didn't go. The rent increase had eaten every spare hour of the last 3 weeks, between Corwin trying to find a new location and Junette calling every commercial landlord within 20 miles who might have a bay available at a price that made sense. But Willa was coming home for the weekend, and Willa loved the fundraiser, loved the silent auction, and the little band that played covers nobody quite recognized, and Junette didn't have it in her to disappoint her daughter on top of everything else. So she put on the blue dress she'd worn to 3 fundraisers running, the one with the small tear near the hem that she'd mended so carefully you'd need to know where to look, and she and Corwin drove to Birch Street together, Willa in the back seat asking questions about the shop that neither of them had good answers for yet. The community center was already half full when they arrived. Round tables with white cloths, a banner strung across the back wall, the smell of the caterers chafing dishes warming up in the kitchen. Junette spotted Delphine Ashworth almost immediately near the silent auction table, wearing something that had probably cost more than a month of Marsh Auto Repair's rent, laughing at something Reginald had said with her head tilted back just enough to be seen doing it. For the first hour, things were fine. Junette bid on a gift basket from the bakery. Corwin talked to Otis Kane, an old friend from the trade school days who still worked at a dealership 2 towns over, about a transmission problem neither of them could quite diagnose secondhand. Willa found her old friends from high school and drifted off toward the dessert table, and for a little while, Junette let herself relax into something close to normal. It fell apart during the live auction, in the lull right after the auctioneer sold off a weekend cabin rental for $1,100. Delphine had a habit of speaking loudly when she'd had 2 glasses of wine, loudly enough that a comment meant for one table often carried to 3. She was talking to a woman named Carol and Pruitt about the rent increase, about how she'd heard poor Junette's husband was finally losing that little garage of his, and Carol, and, to her credit, tried to change the subject. Delphine did not take the hint. "I always told her," Delphine said, not quite looking in Junette's direction but not quite avoiding it either, that a woman only gets so many chances to choose well. She had every opportunity, every single one, and she picked a man who fixes cars for a living and calls it a career. She laughed, the kind of laugh meant to invite others into it. Now look, 26 years and they're about to lose the one thing he ever built. I suppose some people are just destined to struggle. A few people at nearby tables laughed along, more out of reflex than agreement. Others went quiet, the particular quiet of people who know they've just watched something cruel happen and aren't sure whether stepping in will make it worse. Corwin, for tables away, heard every word. Junette watched his hand tighten around his water glass, watched him set it down carefully instead of the way he wanted to set it down, and she understood in that moment that he had heard about the garden club comment 2 weeks ago and had said nothing to her for the exact same reason she'd said nothing to him. Reginald Ashworth, not to be outdone, added his own line, something about how a man ought to have a backup plan by his age, how relying on a single garage bay in this economy was practically asking for trouble. He delivered it like a joke. Nobody at his table laughed particularly hard, but he didn't seem to notice or didn't care. Willa, who had come back from the dessert table in time to hear the tail end of it, went pale and reached for her mother's arm under the table. Junette didn't stand up. She didn't say anything back. What she did was reach over, take Corwin's hand the way she had at their wedding 26 years earlier, and hold it steady on top of the white tablecloth for the rest of the auction, in full view of anyone who cared to look. Otis Kane, who'd overheard the whole exchange from where he stood near the bar, walked over afterward and told Corwin quietly that Delphine Ashworth had never turned a wrench in her life and wouldn't know a socket set from a jewelry box, and that everyone worth knowing in this town understood exactly who Corwin Marsh was. It helped a little. Not as much as Otis probably hoped, but a little. They left before the dancing started, Willa quiet in the back seat, Corwin quiet behind the wheel. Junette stared out the passenger window at the dark shapes of houses passing by, at porch lights and mailboxes and the ordinary evidence of other people's ordinary lives, and thought about the 26 years that had led to this exact moment, sitting in a truck outside a fundraiser, humiliated in front of half the town because her husband fixed cars for a living instead of selling them. She didn't know yet that 3 days later, while clearing out a corner of the shop to make room for a potential subletter, Corwin would finally set the old toolbox down hard enough to crack something loose in the bottom panel that had been sealed shut for over 60 years. The following Monday, Corwin started the grim work of preparing the shop for whatever came next. He hadn't found a new location yet, hadn't given up entirely on staying, but a man from 2 towns over had called about subletting half the bay if Corwin scaled down to weekends only, and pride wasn't going to pay the mortgage. So he spent the morning clearing space along the back wall, moving shelving units, sorting through decades of accumulated clutter that a small business collects without anyone noticing it happening. The toolbox had lived in the same corner for as long as the shop existed, tucked beside the workbench where Corwin could reach it without thinking. Moving it meant lifting a chest that weighed close to 90 pounds fully loaded, and Corwin had done it 1,000 times without incident. This time, his grip slipped on the handle just slightly, just enough that the box came down harder than intended onto the concrete floor. Nothing about the impact seemed unusual at first. Corwin swore under his breath, checked that none of his good sockets had scattered, and knelt down to gather what had spilled. That was when he noticed the bottom panel had separated from the frame by nearly half an inch on one side, a gap that shouldn't have existed in a solid steel chest, no matter how old. He'd never had reason to look closely at the bottom of that box. Why would he? You don't inspect the floor of a toolbox you've used every working day for 26 years, any more than you inspect the floor of your own house. But the gap caught the light wrong, and Corwin was a man who noticed when something mechanical didn't sit the way it should. He emptied the box completely, laying wrenches and sockets and screwdrivers out across the workbench in a rough approximation of their usual order, and looked at the bottom panel from underneath. It wasn't solid. It was a false floor, riveted into place, sitting maybe 2 inches above the actual base of the chest, and the rivet on one corner had sheared clean through from the fall. Corwin called Junette before he did anything else. His voice on the phone had a quality she hadn't heard from him in years, somewhere between confused and afraid, and she left the house without even grabbing her coat. By the time she got to the shop, Corwin had pried the rest of the rivets loose with a flathead screwdriver, careful, methodical, the way he approached any job that mattered. Underneath the false floor was a shallow compartment, maybe 2 inches deep, lined with what had once been oilcloth and had since gone brittle and gray with age. Inside it were 3 things. The first was a small leather pouch, cracked along its folds, tied shut with a cord that disintegrated the moment Corwin touched it. Inside the pouch were coins, more than a dozen of them, gold-colored and heavier than any coin either of them had held before, stamped with an eagle on one face and a woman's profile on the other, dated in the 1890s. The second was a folded document, yellowed and brittle, that Corwin unfolded with the kind of care he'd use on a customer's original title paperwork, worried it would tear apart in his hands. It was handwritten, the ink faded to a rust brown, and at the top, in careful cursive, were the words "Deed of Trust." The third item was a photograph, small and stiff, showing a man in overalls standing in front of what looked like a mine entrance cut into a hillside, a wooden sign above the opening too faded in the image to fully read. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Corwin and Junette sat on the shop floor for a long time. The toolbox emptied around them, the fluorescent lights humming overhead the way they always did, and neither of them said much of anything. Corwin turned the photograph over in his hands twice, 3 times, as though the back might reveal something the front hadn't. "This has to be my grandfather," he finally said. "My dad never talked about him much. Said he died before I was born, worked some kind of claim out west before the family ended up here." Junette took the deed from him gently and read through what she could make out of the handwriting. The document referenced a mining claim, a location described only by section and township numbers that meant nothing to either of them, and a name at the bottom that matched the surname Marsh, though the first name had faded past recognition. "Your father knew this was in here," Junette said slowly, remembering the story Corwin had told her once, years ago, about the day his father handed over the toolbox and said something about everything a man needs already being inside. "He must have known." "He never said anything," Corwin said. 26 years, and he never said a word. It occurred to both of them at roughly the same moment that a man dying slowly, watching his son struggle to build something out of nothing, might have decided that some inheritances needed to be earned through patience rather than handed over outright, that a toolbox full of answers means less to a young man than a toolbox full of tools he has to learn to use himself. Whatever the reason, the coins alone were worth investigating, and the deed raised a question neither of them could answer sitting on a concrete floor in Cedar Hollow. Corwin wrapped the photograph and the deed carefully in a clean shop rag, sealed the coins back in what remained of the pouch, and locked all three items in the shop's small office safe, the one he normally used for a single day's cash deposit. Neither of them slept much that night. Junette lay awake running numbers in her head that she had no real basis for, and Corwin stared at the ceiling thinking about a grandfather he'd never met, a father who'd kept a secret until his last breath, and a toolbox that had ridden in the bed of his truck to every job for 26 years without once hinting at what it carried underneath the wrenches. By morning, they'd agreed on one thing. Before they told a single soul in Cedar Hollow, including Willa and Dale, they needed to find someone who actually knew what a 130-year-old deed and a handful of gold coins might mean. The nearest place Corwin could think to start was the County Historical Society, a small brick building 2 towns over in Millhaven that shared space with the public library and stayed open only 3 days a week. He'd driven past it 100 times without ever once walking through the door. Junette called ahead Tuesday morning and was told that a woman named Professor Louisa Finn came in on Wednesdays and Fridays, an adjunct who taught regional history at the community college and volunteered her afternoons cataloging the society's mining and settlement records. They went in Wednesday, Corwin in his work clothes because he'd come straight from the shop, Junette carrying the deed and the photograph in a manila folder like she was bringing evidence to court. She'd left the coins locked in the safe, not ready yet to carry that kind of weight into a building she'd never been in before. Louisa Finn turned out to be younger than either of them expected, maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and the unhurried manner of someone who'd spent her whole career being patient with old paper. She listened to Corwin explain the toolbox, the false floor, his grandfather he'd never met, without interrupting once, and when he finally slid the folder across the table, she opened it slower than either of them had the patience for. She read the deed twice. The second time, she read it out loud, sounding out the faded portions of the handwriting under her breath, and stopped cold at a line near the bottom. "This says Silver Fork Claim," she said. "Section 14. Do either of you know what county this refers to?" They didn't. Louisa did, or thought she might, and she disappeared into a back room for nearly 20 minutes while Corwin and Junette sat at the folding table under a ceiling fan that clicked on every rotation. When she came back, she was carrying 2 more folders and a rolled county survey map that looked older than the deed itself. Silver Fork was a mining district in Colorado, she said, unrolling the map carefully across the table, weighting the corners with a stapler, a coffee mug, and her own reading glasses case. Late 1800s. Small operation, mostly silver, some gold. It played out around 1905 as far as most records show, and the district was largely abandoned. She traced a finger along a faint line on the map. Section 14, Township 6. If this deed is legitimate, and I have no reason yet to think it isn't, it's describing a specific parcel within that district. Abandoned doesn't sound like it's worth much, Corwin said. Abandoned as a working mine doesn't mean abandoned as a piece of land, Louisa said. And it doesn't mean the claim itself lapsed. Mineral rights and surface rights get separated all the time, especially with old claims like this. Whether this deed still holds any legal weight is a question for a property attorney, not a historian. What I can tell you is that the document itself looks period accurate. The ink, the paper stock, the phrasing. If it's a forgery, it's an extraordinarily good one, and I can't think of a single reason anyone would forge a deed and then hide it inside a toolbox for over a century. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Louisa spent another hour walking them through the mining district's history, pulling references from a bound volume of old assay reports that mentioned the Silver Fork claims by number. She found a listing for Section 14 dated 1891, registered under the name J. Marsh, and when she found it, she looked up at Corwin with an expression that made Junette's stomach tighten. "J. Marsh," Louisa said. "That would be your great-grandfather, I'd guess, based on the dates. Which means this claim passed down through your family for at least 2 generations before it ended up sealed inside a toolbox." Corwin sat with that for a long moment. He thought about his father, a quiet man who'd worked as a machinist most of his life and never once mentioned owning anything more than the house he died in. He thought about the story of the toolbox handoff, the strange comment about patience, and wondered whether his father had known exactly what was hidden in that false floor, or whether the secret had simply been passed down unopened, generation after generation, a family heirloom nobody understood they were carrying. "What happens now?" Junette asked. Louisa took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. "Now you need two things. A property attorney who specializes in mineral rights, because Colorado law on this is not simple, and someone from the state to verify whether that claim was ever formally abandoned or transferred. If this claim is still valid, and if there's anything left in that ground worth extracting, you could be looking at something significant." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I don't want to get ahead of the facts, but I've spent 15 years around old mining records, and I've never seen a deed like this turn up with coins from the same period and a photograph that matches the location. That's not nothing." She recommended an attorney 2 hours away, a man named Bram Whitlock who'd handled mineral rights disputes for the State Historical Preservation Office more than once, and wrote his number on a sticky note that Junette folded into her wallet like it was worth more than the deed itself. They drove home mostly in silence, the manila folder on the seat between them, the ceiling fan's clicking rhythm still somehow stuck in Junette's ears. Corwin gripped the wheel tighter than usual, and somewhere past the county line, he finally said what they'd both been thinking since Louisa Fenn first spoke the word Silver Fork claim out loud. "Dad knew," he said. "He had to have known. And he still let me grow up believing this family never had anything but hard work and bad luck." Junette reached over and put her hand on his arm, the same steady grip she'd used at the fundraiser 2 weeks earlier. Except this time there was nothing to hold back and nothing to survive. Just a 2-hour drive ahead of them, an attorney named Bram Whitlock waiting at the other end of it, and a question neither of them could answer yet about what a 130-year-old mining claim in Colorado might actually be worth. Bram Whitlock's office sat above a hardware store in downtown Millhaven, a narrow set of stairs leading up to 2 rooms that smelled like coffee and old carpet. He wasn't what either of them expected. Younger than Louisa Fenn, maybe 40, with a habit of tapping his pen against a legal pad while he listened rather than while he talked. He'd cleared his afternoon for them after Louisa called ahead, and he read through the deed twice before he said a single word about what it might mean. "I need to be straightforward with you both," he said, setting the document down carefully. "I'm not going to tell you this is worth a fortune, because I don't know that yet, and anyone who tells you that on day one is either guessing or lying. What I can tell you is that this deed appears legitimate. The chain of family ownership Louisa traced backs that up, and Colorado law on old mining claims is specific enough that we can actually get you real answers instead of speculation." He spent the better part of an hour explaining what those answers would require. A formal title search through the county recorder's office in Colorado. Verification with the state's Division of Reclamation, Mining and Safety to determine whether the Silver Fork claim had ever been formally patented, abandoned, or absorbed into later claims. And if the claim held up, a mineral survey to determine whether anything commercially viable remained in that section of ground, or whether its value now rested entirely in the land itself and whatever rights came attached to it. "That could take months," Corwin said. "It could," Bram agreed. "I won't pretend otherwise. But I'll tell you this much for free. A claim from 1891 that never got formally patented sometimes reverts to unclaimed status, which would be bad news for you. But a claim that was patented, meaning the federal government granted full title rather than just mining rights, that's real property. Real property that's been sitting in your family's name, undisturbed, for over a century. If that's what we're dealing with here, we're not just talking about whatever silver might still be in that ground. We're talking about surface rights on land that's likely appreciated significantly, especially if it sits anywhere near what's become a resort corridor in the decades since." Junette asked the question she'd been holding back since they walked in. "And if it is patented? If it's real?" Bram set his pen down. "Then you own a piece of Colorado that your family forgot they had. I've seen patented claims from that era sell, once cleared and verified, anywhere from the low 6 figures for a small, remote parcel up to 7 figures if there's road access, water rights, or renewed mineral interest. I'm not promising you a number. I'm telling you the range is real, and it's worth finding out where you land in it." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next 6 weeks moved slower than either of them expected and faster than either of them felt ready for. Bram filed the initial title search. Louisa Finn, unwilling to let the discovery sit idle, reached out to a colleague at the Colorado Historical Society who pulled additional assay records showing the Silver Fork District had seen a brief renewed interest in the 1970s, when a mining company leased several adjacent claims for exploratory drilling. Section 14 had not been among them, which Bram explained was actually good news. It meant the claim had likely sat untouched and undisturbed the entire time, exactly the kind of clean history that made a title search easier rather than harder. The coins went to an appraiser in Millhaven who specialized in period currency. 19 Liberty Head gold coins, dated between 1889 and 1897, in remarkably preserved condition given their storage. The appraiser's number, when it came back, made Junette sit down at her own kitchen table. Combined numismatic and gold value, just over $81,000. Then, in the second week of June, Bram called with the news that mattered most. The Silver Fork claim on Section 14 had, in fact, been formally patented in 1893, a full transfer of federal title to J. Marsh and his heirs. It had never been sold, never been transferred, never reverted to the state. Through 3 generations of a family that had no idea what they were sitting on, the deed had simply waited. "There's more," Bram said, and Junette could hear something in his voice that hadn't been there in their first meeting, an edge of genuine excitement he'd been careful to keep out of his professional tone until now. "That parcel sits about 4 miles from what's now a growing resort development outside of town called Cascade Bend. Land values in that corridor have gone up considerably over the last 15 years. I had a colleague in Colorado run a preliminary market comparison based on parcel size and location. Conservatively, and I want to stress conservatively, we're looking at land value alone somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. That's before anyone even considers whether there's commercially viable mineral content still in the ground, which would require its own separate survey." Corwin didn't say anything for a long moment. He was standing in the shop when the call came through, and Junette watched him lean back against the workbench, the same workbench that had held the toolbox for over 2 decades, and put his free hand over his eyes. "My dad worked as a machinist his whole life," Corwin finally said, more to Junette than to Bram. "He clipped coupons. He drove a car until the wheels fell off it every single time, and this whole time we had this." Bram, still on speaker, said what neither of them had quite let themselves say out loud yet. "Whatever the reason your father kept this quiet, Mr. Marsh, you and your wife are looking at a piece of property worth, at minimum, several $100,000, sitting in Colorado with your family's name on it since 1893. I'd recommend you both sit with that for a few days before we talk next steps." Junette walked over and stood beside her husband at the workbench, the same spot where he'd built a business out of almost nothing, the same spot where a broken rivet had cracked open 60 years of silence 3 weeks earlier, and neither of them said much of anything at all. There wasn't much left to say that the numbers hadn't already said for them. Word of what happened at Marsh Auto Repair does not stay contained in a town the size of Cedar Hollow, no matter how carefully 2 people try to keep it quiet. It started with the appraiser in Millhaven, who mentioned the gold coins to his assistant, who happened to be married to a woman on the fire department auxiliary. By the second week of July, most of Cedar Hollow knew that Corwin Marsh had found something valuable in that old toolbox of his. Nobody outside Corwin, Junette, Bram Whitlock, and Louisa Finn knew the actual number. But speculation filled the gap the way it always does, and the speculation ranged wildly from a modest inheritance to outright treasure. Corwin and Junette let people wonder. They weren't ready to say anything official until the title work was fully settled. And Bram had been clear that talking too soon could complicate things if anyone tried to challenge the claim once word got around that it had real value. Otis Kane heard it from a customer and drove straight to the shop after work, not to gossip, just to shake Corwin's hand and say he was glad, genuinely glad, without asking a single question about numbers. It meant more to Corwin than he let on. Other people were not so restrained. A cousin of Reginald Ashworth's, twice removed, showed up at the shop one afternoon asking about investment opportunities before Corwin had even said a word about what he planned to do with anything. Delphine Ashworth's reaction took longer to reach them, but when it did, it came through Carolyn Pruitt, the same woman who'd tried to change the subject at the fundraiser back in April. Carolyn told Junette, gently and a little sheepishly, that Delphine had been telling people at the salon that she'd always known Corwin had potential, that she'd simply meant her earlier comments as motivation, that surely Junette understood she'd never truly meant any harm. Junette did not respond to any of it directly. She had learned, over 26 years of marriage to a man people underestimated, that the loudest apologies usually arrived only once the apologizing had become convenient. By late August, the title work was finished. The Silver Fork claim belonged to Corwin Marsh, clear and undisputed, and a private buyer connected through Bram's Colorado contacts had made an offer on the land itself. $540,000 cash, with no mineral survey required since the buyer wanted the parcel for a planned expansion of the resort corridor rather than for anything still underground. Combined with the appraised value of the coins, Corwin and Junette Marsh, 26 years into a marriage people had mocked as a poor woman's mistake, were suddenly worth over $600,000. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They talked about it for 3 straight nights before deciding anything. Sitting at the same kitchen table where Corwin had once run the math on the rent increase 4 different ways, they ran different math now, and every version of it left them uneasy about keeping all of it for themselves. The decision they landed on wasn't complicated, even if it took them 3 nights to get there. First, they bought the building that housed Marsh Auto Repair outright, the whole strip of buildings the Pittsburgh developer had raised the rent on, paying cash and ending, permanently, any question of whether the shop would survive another landlord spreadsheet. Second, they paid off Willa's remaining student loans in full, and set aside a fund to help Dale put a down payment on a house near his construction job. Third, and this was Junette's idea more than Corwin's, though he agreed without hesitation, they set aside $75,000 to start a small assistance fund through the volunteer fire department, the same organization whose fundraiser had hosted the worst night of the whole ordeal, earmarked specifically for local small business owners facing sudden rent increases or unexpected repair costs that threatened to shut them down. They called it the Founders Bench Fund, named for the old wooden bench that sat outside Marsh Auto Repair, where customers waited while their cars got fixed, the same bench Corwin's father had built by hand back when the shop first opened. When the fund was announced at the fire department's fall meeting, open to the public the way most of their meetings were, several people in the room who had laughed at Corwin behind his back over the years sat quietly, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the folding chairs. Delphine Ashworth was not at that meeting. She sent a card instead, weeks later, handwritten, apologizing in more direct terms than Junette expected, admitting that she'd said cruel things out of her own insecurities about a marriage of her own that wasn't nearly as solid as it looked from the outside. Junette read the card twice, decided it was sincere enough to accept, and wrote back a short, kind reply. She didn't need Delphine's guilt. She'd stopped needing anything from Delphine Ashworth a long time ago. Reginald Ashworth's apology came differently. He showed up at the shop in person on a Tuesday afternoon, stood awkwardly near the open bay door while Corwin finished up a brake job, and eventually said that he'd spoken out of turn at the fundraiser and that Marsh Auto Repair had always done honest work on every car his dealership had ever referred there. It wasn't much of an apology, more of a business courtesy dressed up as one, but Corwin shook his hand anyway. He'd learned from his father that holding a grudge costs more than it's worth, and he had better things to spend himself on now. The town's reaction, on the whole, softened faster than either Corwin or Junette expected. People are quicker to admire a man once they know what he's sitting on, and slower to admit that the admiration should have come regardless. Junette noticed it in small ways. A wave from someone who used to just nod, an invitation to the garden club luncheon that she politely declined. The particular quiet that settles over a room when people realize they misjudge someone and don't quite know how to say so out loud. She didn't need them to say it. She had Corwin, 26 years of marriage, a shop that would outlive both of them now, and a toolbox sitting empty in the corner of the garage, its secret finally out in the open after 60 years of silence. 1 year later, In the spring of 2025, the bench outside Marsh Auto Repair had a fresh coat of paint and a small brass plaque bolted into the wood. Easy to miss unless you knew to look for it. It read simply, "In memory of the men who built what we didn't know we had." Corwin had commissioned it himself, for his father and his grandfather both. Men who had carried a secret through their whole working lives and never once complained about the weight of what they didn't have. The shop itself looked mostly the same from the outside. The same hand-painted sign, the same bell on the door that still didn't ring quite right no matter how many times Corwin adjusted it. But it belonged to him now, building and all, free of any landlord's spreadsheet, and he'd expanded into the second bay next door, hiring a young mechanic named Trevor Voss straight out of trade school, the same trade school Corwin himself had attended 28 years earlier. Junette still kept the books, though there was less to worry over now than there used to be. She'd taken on a role with the Founders Bench Fund too, reviewing applications from small business owners around 3 counties who'd found themselves in the same position Corwin had been in a year earlier, staring down a rent increase or an equipment failure with nowhere left to turn. In its first year, the fund had helped 11 businesses stay open. A bakery in Millhaven, a plumber 2 towns over, a woman who ran a small daycare out of a converted barn and couldn't afford a new furnace before winter hit. Dale had used his portion to put a down payment on a house near his job, the first property either of the Marsh children had ever owned. Willa graduated debt-free that spring, walked the stage in a cap and gown with her parents in the 3rd row, Corwin in a suit that fit him better than the one he'd worn to his own wedding 27 years earlier. Delphine Ashworth still lived in the house on Aspen Ridge with the fountain that ran in winter, though Junette heard, secondhand, that things between her and Reginald had grown strained over the past year for reasons that had nothing to do with the Marshes at all. Junette felt no satisfaction in that. She meant what she wrote back in that card. Some grudges simply weren't worth the room they took up. On a Sunday evening that April, Corwin and Junette sat on the front steps of the house on Fenwick Street, the same house he'd renovated one room at a time over 2.5 decades, watching the streetlights come on one by one down the block. The toolbox sat inside the garage behind them, empty now except for the tools it had always actually needed to hold, though Corwin had never once considered getting rid of it. Some things you don't question. You just keep. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't dropped it that day? Junette asked. If that rivet never sheared? Corwin thought about it for a while before answering, the way he answered most things. I figure it would have sat there another 60 years, he said. Long after I was gone. Somebody else would have found it eventually. Dale, maybe, or his kids. I just got lucky it was me. It wasn't luck, Junette said. You never stopped showing up to that shop every single morning for 26 years, even during the years when it barely made sense to. That toolbox waited for a man who'd earned what was inside it. I believe that. Corwin didn't have a response for that right away. He just took her hand, the same steady grip from the wedding, from the fundraiser, from every hard season in between, and they sat there a while longer as the last of the daylight gave out over Cedar Hollow. People used to say Junette Marsh married beneath herself, that she'd traded a better life for a man who fixed cars and called it a career. Nobody says that anymore. But more than that, the shape of what they say has changed. They don't talk about the money, not really, not for long. What they talk about is the bench fund, the 11 businesses it kept afloat, the plaque with 2 names on it that most people in town had never once heard before last spring. They talk about a man who kept showing up to a single-bay garage every morning for 26 years without knowing what he was sitting on, and a woman who held his hand in public the night half the town laughed at both of them, and neither of them let go. That's the part of this story worth carrying with you. Not the coins, not the $600,000, not even the deed itself. It's the 26 years that came before any of it, the years nobody was watching, the years that looked to outsiders like a woman settling for less than she deserved. Corwin Marsh was never poor in the way Delphine Ashworth meant it. He owned a business he built with his own hands, a marriage that held steady through every hard season, and a father's patience passed down through a toolbox that waited exactly as long as it needed to. The fortune was real, but it was never the point. The point was who he already was before anyone knew it was there. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated by people who thought they knew your worth better than you did, let us know in the comments. Tell us about a time someone doubted you and got it wrong. And if you believe, the way Junette believed for 26 years, that a person's value has nothing to do with what's in their bank account, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.